Welcome to today's VMware Virtual SAN demonstration. My name is Travis Lawrence. I am a systems engineer with Arrow ECS. Today we're going to show you how simple it is to set up Virtual SAN. From the licensing configuration, networking, and finally mounting the vSAN data store on the 3 hosts in our Solutions Lab environment. Overall, it takes less than 15 minutes to deploy this lab scenario, and hopefully it's valuable for you and your technical teams to deploy in a lab scenario, or at least to see how the product really functions. So let's get into the demonstration. Today we're going to go through the basic setup of vSAN. That really consists of 3 things. 1 being licensing, making sure we're licensed for vSAN on our vSphere 6 cluster. 2, setting up the networking. And then 3, finally enabling vSAN and assigning those disks to the vSAN group. So here to get started, we have our vSphere 6 environment. This is our lab environment. It's a fairly small environment. But the first piece, as I mentioned, is to go and look at licensing. So regardless of whether you have a trial license and you're just testing this out in a lab or test dev environment, or you have production licenses, we want to make sure this license is assigned first so we can enable the vSAN features. So from here, from the home screen, the vSphere web client, we click licensing. And we can see that I've already provisioned the license to this cluster. Again, vSAN is a cluster level feature, so we assign this license. All the hosts in the cluster need the licensing. So for those of you who have a license key, to add a license key to your environment, we just click this create new licenses plus button, and then we can paste in the license key that you've been given. And from there, we can follow the steps in the wizard and assign those to the hosts that will utilize vSAN. So that part is pretty straightforward. From here, we'll go on to the networking section. So next, we will go to the hosts and clusters view. And a bit about this lab environment. Again, when you're architecting for vSAN, there are several considerations, particularly around networking. So first and foremost, VMware does recommend 10 gig network adapters for an environment, for production environments. So considering how large your cluster will be, whether that will be used for production or test dev environments, we do need to kind of keep that in mind, especially when you're looking at hardware, purchasing hardware, or trying to repurpose hardware for vSAN. In this lab environment, it's a smaller lab environment. You can see here that I've got 3 hosts. They each have 4 1 gig network adapters. So for this example, we're going to show a basic configuration with 1 gig network adapters and a standard virtual switch. You can also definitely use this, as VMware would recommend, with 10 gig adapters and actually using network I/O control to carve up that bandwidth between the different functions in your environment. So VM network management, if you have IP-based storage, and vSAN, different VM kernel level activities would leverage those adapters. So again, if you're using 10 gig, you don't need to dedicate those 10 gig NICs to vSAN, but we do need to provide enough adequate bandwidth for vSAN to function. So as I mentioned, this is a pretty basic environment. We've got a single vCenter server, a data center, and then vSAN, as I mentioned previously, is configured at the cluster level. So we'll do some of the configuration there. But prior to actually enabling vSAN and assigning disks, we need to make sure we have the proper networking configuration. So as you can see, I've got 3 hosts in the environment. Let's look at what networking needs to be set up for each particular host. So we'll select the first host here and click Manage. And as part of the basic configuration, the setup of vSphere 6, we can see we've got basic networking configured. So I've got a VM network that is assigned to the VM-NIC2 physical adapter. I've also got management networks sharing this same vSwitch 0 that has an active adapter of VM-NIC0. So pretty basic setup using virtual standard switches. Again, for vSAN, we need to dedicate, the recommendation is to dedicate multiple 1 gig network adapters or a portion of a 10 gig adapter. So for logical separation in this type of environment, I'm going to simply create an additional vSwitch. Again, depending on your architecture and design, that may vary of how you want to allocate those specific physical adapters. But know that we do need to pay attention to the VMware documentation around that. But from here, so to create an additional vSwitch, I will select Add Host Networking. And then since vSAN is a kernel level service, we're going to add a VM kernel network adapter. So we can see again the other types of services that also use a VM kernel network adapter, things like vMotion, IP-based storage, or FT. In this case, vSAN is what we need here, so we'll select that and click Next. And as I mentioned, for logical separation purposes here, I'm going to create a new standard switch. We can use this with a virtual distributed switch if you'd like. If you have a larger environment, again, when you get beyond a handful of hosts, you have beyond 6 or 8 hosts, typically we see a lot of advantage to using the VDS and being able to make network configurations one time and have those populate across the network, across all hosts. So that definitely can be used with vSAN. So from here, once we're creating the virtual standard switch, we need to assign adapters to that, to assign physical adapters to the switch. So I'm going to click Add Adapters. And vSAN, it's good to note on a single subnet, vSAN only supports one physical NIC. So we want to have some redundancy here, but we're not going to make both of those adapters active at a time. We're going to make one active adapter and one standby adapter. So in this case, I'm going to select VMNIC1 as the active adapter and click OK. That adds it into the active adapters list. I'm going to click the plus again and add VMNIC3 as a standby adapter. So we can see those populated in the list. On the right side here, we can see some of the networking information. We can leave that as a default for this. We click Next. And from here, we're going to give the port group a specific name. So since this is vSAN, I'm just going to simply name it vSAN. In your environment, again, since this is storage level traffic, it may be a good idea to separate that on a different VLAN. For purposes in our lab environment, this is a pretty flat network, so we're just going to leave it on with no VLAN. And then really the important piece of this here, again, is VM kernel level port settings, what type of traffic we want to enable on these physical adapters. So in our case, simply check the virtual SAN traffic box, and that will enable that on this interface or these interfaces. We click Next. And we're going to assign a static IP address for that VM kernel port. So generally, this is a best practice to always assign a physical, a static address rather, in these types of situations, so you know which hosts are using which IPs for these VM kernel ports. Similarly with a subnet mask, we've got all of our network information entered, and we can click Next. And then we get the final review of all of the settings we've entered. So again, we're creating a new standard vSwitch, automatically named vSwitch1, which adapters, which physical adapters we've assigned to that vSwitch, what I named the port group, what our VLAN is, and then which VM kernel level services are enabled on that particular interface. And then finally, the IP information that we've entered since this set up a static configuration. So from there, we click Finish, and after a moment, this will refresh and show us our new vSwitch that we've created. So I can select that vSwitch. We can see, again, see the port group that we've created, the VM kernel port, and the static IP that's created for that VM kernel port. We can also see that the active adapter is VMNIC1, and we can also see that VMNIC3 is also assigned to this vSwitch. If we dug down into the settings, we would see that that is set as the standby adapter as we configured it. So now that we've done that on this particular host, that configuration needs to be repeated for all the hosts in the environment. So again, if you're configuring a larger vSAN cluster, 8 nodes, 16 nodes, and vSphere-6 supports up to 64 nodes, you would definitely in those situations want to use a VDS because you would make this process a lot simpler. But I will show you here that we have configured a similar vSwitch on each of these other hosts in the environment. So we have, again, a secondary vSwitch with a vSAN port group and assigned a different VM kernel port IP to those. But each of these are configured in a similar fashion. So on the same on the third host, same port group, different IP address is the only real change. So now at this point, we've got 3 hosts. They each have one active adapter and a VM kernel port set up to pass vSAN traffic. So here really comes the easiest part of the setup, is the final enabling of vSAN and then assigning those disks in each of those hosts to vSAN to use for a vSAN data store. So from there, we can actually select our cluster. And we'll click Manage. We can see a variety of the cluster level services that we have. But here we can see that VSAN, under Virtual SAN General, VSAN is turned off, and this part is grayed out. So to enable this, we simply click Edit and turn on Virtual SAN. Now we do have a few options under how to actually enable this. So one being that we can select Automatic, and this simply means that VSAN will look at the eligible disks in each of the selected hosts and automatically add them in and leverage them for the VSAN data store. So if you want sort of the easy button, you can click Turn on Virtual SAN, click Automatic, and it will automatically claim those disks. For purposes of this demo, we're going to use the manual method for two reasons. One, to allow you to really see the process of how we select the disks in the environment, how simple it is even from that perspective, but also just to get a look at sort of underlying architecture, see what type of disks we have, and discuss that a little bit. Click Turn on VSAN, we left it on manual, and click OK. And in a moment here, it'll say, okay, VSAN has been enabled. We can see that right now, as far as resources being contributed, we have 0 hosts, 0 disks. We do see our networking configuration as normal, so it does check to make sure that we have VM kernel adapters assigned on each of those hosts. To assign disks, we go into Disk Management. And from here, again, here's one of the pieces that it's beneficial to show. So right now we can see that of the 2 eligible disks on each of these hosts, that none are contributing to the VSAN cluster. We can also see that each of the hosts are connected and that in general virtual SAN is healthy, though it hasn't really been provisioned at this point. To assign disks to the cluster, we can click this Claim Disks button. And this shows us in a little more detail what disks are available on each host. So again, the most important piece of this is a hybrid VSAN configuration, so that means we need 1 hard drive or 1 spinning disk and 1 flash or SSD disk per node, at least for the first 3 nodes. So this is showing us, and the default is showing us the eligible hosts, and we can see that each of these has a 93 gig flash disk and a 1.8 terabyte spinning disk. And we meet the requirements for each of those. Again, the simplest way to do this is we can click this button here and select all eligible disks, and that will actually select the disks and validate our configuration down here. Now there may be situations where you want to, in certain environments where you don't have an even number of disks and you don't want to necessarily dedicate all those to the VSAN cluster, you can obviously select. That's the purpose of this manual configuration process, is we can look through and select the disks that we want to. But in this lab scenario, if I would have selected Automatic, it would have chosen all these disks because they are eligible and it fit the bill as far as the VSAN configuration. So from here, it's as simple as saying OK and turning on VSAN. And again, we wait for a moment while the configuration is enabled, but what's going to happen behind the scenes is it's going to pull all those disks together, make sure that we have the network configuration in place, and then it'll create our VSAN data store, aggregating all of that space across the hosts. So we can see it automatically refresh, and now we have a disk group created. We can see the number of disks in use. So we know that VSAN's enabled. And we can go from a cluster level, look at related objects and data stores. And we can see all of the data stores inside this cluster. So we can see all of the local data stores on each of the hosts, the individual hosts. And now we can see our new VSAN data store. So our 5.4 terabytes of capacity that is available to each of these hosts. And selecting each of the hosts, we can see that they've automatically, that storage, VSAN storage, has automatically been mounted to each of those hosts, and they can leverage that as part of their capacity. If we select our data stores, we can see that each of these hosts, that this host has access to its local data store, but it also has access to that VSAN data store. And with that, our VSAN configuration is complete. And we can see how simple it is to use commodity disks inside the hypervisor to create a highly available and performant storage tier. So to review, we really make sure we have the licensing in place. We set up our networking, make sure we've architected and enabled the specific physical adapters on each host, whether we're using a standard switch or a virtual switch. And then from that point, it's as simple as really clicking the checkbox to enable VSAN and then assigning those disks to VSAN, the VSAN data store, whether you do that through an automatic process or a manual process as we saw today. That concludes our VMware VSAN 6 demonstration. Please be on the lookout for other technical sessions, and thank you for joining us.